Appamada and its programs are supported by your generosity, and your generosity and support makes such a difference. You can find a link for contributions on the website at appamada.org. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to start. Later today, we are going to be celebrating Jukai for Cassie and Trouty and Trent, members of the Sangha, long-term members of the Sangha, who are receiving the precepts in this formal ceremony today. I asked Peg and Flint yesterday what Jukai means, and Peg said that the Kai refers to the precepts, and Ju is like ceremony, right? And Peg and Flint have renamed this as
Bodhisattva initiation ceremony.
Bodhisattva initiation ceremony. So, and during the last week, I got to participate in the intensive here in person, and Peg and Flint kind of created, showed how the precepts and vow and everything that goes into it, and the relationships within our sangha, relationships out into the world, into our interior spaces, that they are all a kind of a rainforest, a whole ecosystem of giving and receiving, and just a very beautiful living structure that comes from that comes from and that leads to the step that Cassie and the others are formally avowing today. So I'm going to talk some about part of that, the precepts, because I'm in the role of leading the precepts group for this year. And Lipscomb is going to talk about another crucial part of what leads to Jukai, and that is the sewing of Buddha's robe, and McCready who received. I stumble on that every time. Taking, receiving, taking the vow and receiving of Jukai, what that experience was like last year. In I believe the first Jukai at Appamada, right?
No.
No?
First since the pandemic.
First since the pandemic. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. All right. So originally, the precepts were from the Vinaya, from a Sanskrit word for leading apart, meaning taking monastic discipline, rules for living together as homeless monastics, and how to do that, how to meet other people within the framework of a harmonious framework in a very unusual situation for most people. And then the precepts have been adapted through different cultural settings and for different groups of people, as it became clear that living in accordance with Buddha's teachings in various living situations requires a strong ethical guidance as a basis for skillful means in fully embracing the Buddha's virtues of loving kindness, sympathetic joy, compassion, and patience. One important point has been made many times by teachers here, and I think it's very important to say it here, that in Soto Zen, the precepts are not equivalent to the 10 Commandments. One will not be punished by an angry God for breaking any of the precepts, although, as we find in our lives, our actions do have consequences, certainly in this life. By studying the precepts instead of following habitual patterns, the way humans have for millennia, and the way I seemingly have for millennia, you can more clearly see the consequences of your actions and attitudes in this life, day by day, which is itself a form of liberation. One of the messages of the precepts is one also reiterated in the Lojong slogans, which when I first gave this talk, I was in the middle of studying with many of the folks who are online here. And the slogan 45 which reminds us that our human life is precious because with good spiritual guides and with a willingness to hold that preciousness to our hearts, we already have everything we need to awaken in this life. Here are some of the ways the precepts have been expressed. In Theravadan Buddhism, there are 5 basic precepts for lay Buddhists. I undertake to observe the precept to abstain from killing. I undertake to observe the precept to abstain from stealing. I undertake to observe the precept to abstain from misusing sex. I undertake to observe the precept to abstain from lying. I undertake to observe the precept to abstain from abusing intoxicants. Mahayana Buddhists can take related but similar forms of precepts vows that can be 10 or 13 or 16 precepts. There are the 3 pure precepts. I undertake to avoid unskillful or harmful action. I undertake to act skillfully. I undertake to save all beings. And then the grave or grand precepts: not killing, not stealing, not misusing sex, not lying, not abusing intoxicants, not talking about others' errors or faults, not elevating oneself and blaming others, not being stingy, not being angry, not speaking ill of the 3 treasures or refuges, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then the 3 bodhisattva precepts, celebrated especially in Jukai, are the vows to take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And if I can find my paper here. The teacher and writer Nancy Wudjo Baker says that in particular, in the Dogen-inspired lineages of Zen, the precepts are presented, I just read them as not stealing, not lying, not killing. She says they are presented as non-stealing, non-lying, and so forth, instead of not stealing and don't steal, and not lying and don't lie. This will help us see why the Jukai ceremony of receiving the precepts is not about becoming Buddhist, but rather about becoming a Buddha. And just a brief quote, there's a part of the Shobogenzo called the Shohaku Makusa, or on not doing wrong, which has at least some of Dogen's reflections on the precepts. And it's hard to translate into English the terminology that Dogen uses for this. He makes a kind of a compound noun out of verbs and gerunds and stuff. But basically, and I recently used this in another talk. Brad Warner wrote a book, the teacher Brad Warner wrote a book called Don't Be a Jerk and Other Lessons from Dogen. And I'm on screen with Nelda. Nelda and I have had a very deep conversation about this afterwards, and we're going to come back to this later on. So I'm having to retranslate from Brad Warner's version because I couldn't follow it in the original Dogen version. But basically, Warner says that Dogen emphasizes a particular point. A wrongdoer is not something you are. And this, so this is one way in which Buddhism and Soto Zen in particular are different from the Abrahamic religions, right? A wrongdoer is not something that you are. Being a wrongdoer is something you do, and it only takes place while you are doing wrong. There is no wrongdoer outside of you taking the actions of being a wrongdoer. You cease to be a wrongdoer. When you cease to do those actions, the wrongdoer that you were when you were doing those wrong actions vanishes instantly. So a much different starting point, a much different psychology, a much different understanding of human nature and of all of reality. And then our main text for the precepts class here, as everyone knows, is Daien Isshin Rizeto's book, Waking Up to What You Do. And she reorders that list of 16 and collapses them into 8 precepts that are broader and much more abstract, much more in line with Dogen's leadership on this, and stated in more positive language. I take up the way of speaking truthfully. I take up the way of speaking of others with openness and possibility. I take up the way of meeting others on equal ground. I take up the way of cultivating a clear mind. I take up the way of taking only what is freely given and giving freely all that I can. I take up the way of engaging in sexual intimacy respectfully and with an open heart. I take up the way of letting go of anger. I take up the way of supporting life. And she reminds us that the precepts can be conceptualized in various ways as a beacon, a kind of a beacon, a reminder that a nearly infinite web of interactions and interbeing is involved in everything we encounter, and that it would do us well to consider this carefully when we choose to take an action which has the potential to be hurtful. As a sign above a doorway, an invitation to enter and explore the intentions of our actions openly and honestly. It's not a directive to berate ourselves for our behavior, but to face squarely the consequences of our actions on ourselves and others, and to consider those as riddles that deny us easy answers. Is it always wrong to break a precept? Can we be too rigid in holding to precepts and thereby cause harm and be unskillful? And they can be seen as should or should not, binary. Should in the sense of embracing difficult exploration, and should not in the sense of coming to know when our actions are motivated by selfishness, even when we don't want to believe that about ourselves. Rosetto talks about approaching the precepts using a metaphor from a trapeze artist, the dead spot or the midpoint, when one is midair, has let go of one trapeze bar and is not yet supported by the other. She writes, whatever it is, no matter how big or small, this dead spot appears when we cannot engage in our habitual way of holding and grasping for the bars, either because we are forced to let go or we willfully launch ourselves into midair. Life pries our fingers loose, and no matter how much we try to avoid it, we end up in the suspended moment, not knowing what comes next. Pema Chodron offers a much more comfortable metaphor for me. I hang in midair, it gives me a primal fear. Right? She says, our anxiety, heartbreak, and tenderness mark an in-between state. It's the kind of place we usually want to avoid. The challenge is to let it soften us rather than to make us more rigid and afraid. Becoming intimate with the queasy feeling of being in the middle of nowhere, which the precepts bring up over and over, only makes our hearts more tender. When we are brave enough to stay in the middle, compassion arises spontaneously. By not knowing, not hoping to know, and not acting like we know what's happening, we begin to access our inner strength. And I'll wrap this up in a few more paragraphs here. Robert Rosenbaum, in his new book entitled That Is Not Your Mind, writes, the precepts provide structure to support us, forms to pour ourselves into, means to strengthen our moral muscles so that our bones can take us where our intentions aim. They need to be actualized in concrete actions that fit specific situations. If the way we deal with the situation fosters a sense of mutuality, that's a sign we are acting in accordance with the precepts. When we create paths wide enough to make room for everyone, we're traipsing through the terrain of interbeing. The teaching of the Dharma is simple. We are all in this together. That's it. So, thank you. And
on to the sewing. Or to Buddha's robe. It's very lovely to be here and speak. Thank you all for your kind attention. I do feel, I also was at the intensive that we just had and feel so much resonance because of my experience of the intensive with the words that you spoke, that you read, about interbeing in that dead spot, that spot between the balance of momentum and gravity. That time when you're not, those two things are right in balance, and how that's always changing. It doesn't last. If that doesn't last, you can't stay there. You have to keep moving, one way or the other. So I'm going to speak about sewing Buddha's robe, which is one of the aspects or one of the practices involved in Jukai. When people approach a teacher and ask to sew, the criteria or the qualification, the requirement here at Appamada is that you are studying precepts in the class, or you have in the past studied the precepts. So you need to be in an intimate connection with study of the precepts in order to begin sewing Buddha's robe. Buddha's robe is this. For us at Appamada, we don't wear formal robes, but this is Buddha's robe, called a rakasu. And it brings us back to that still point, that between momentum and gravity, that point between the material, something you're sewing, something that you buy some fabric or someone gives you some fabric, you cut it, you measure it, you mark it, you stitch it together, you follow a set of instructions, you create something that you can hold and touch and others can see. And what is this thing? What is the connection between precepts and rakasu? What is the connection between our everyday life and just this ultimate reality? So I'd like to read several things, and you're not going to be able to see this, but I'll describe it. This is a book called Buddha's Robe is Sewn. It's more a pamphlet that was put together, compiled by a sewing teacher at the Berkeley Zen Center, Jean Selkirk. And it's basically a compendium of lots of different sources talking about Buddha's robe and sewing. And so lots of different voices here and amazing wisdom in this tiny little book. So I'd like to start with a quote from one of our founders, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, about the Dharma of Buddha's robe. Our rakasu is not just symbol of our teaching, but is actually Dharma itself. But unless you have proper understanding of it, the rakasu is something which you wear as a symbol of being Buddhist. But that is not proper understanding. The proper understanding of our zazen or rakasu is same, not different. So unless you have real experience of zazen experience, rakasu is not actually rakasu. It is just something you wear. It is not Dharma itself. Again, we're back to, there is a thing, in our case, a blue square of fabric around your neck. And in the other case, there's Dharma. They are the same thing. What does that mean about receiving precepts and creating one of these rakusu? The next quote I'd like to give is from another of our founders, Zenke Blanche Hartman, who was not only a great teacher, but a dedicated sewing teacher. She says, sewing Buddha's robe is first and foremost a devotional practice. By taking refuge with each stitch, immerses me in just this stitch, stitch after stitch, just as following the exhale immerses me in just this breath as I sit zazen. With each stitch, we say the refuges in Japanese. Namu kie butsu, Namu kie bo, Namu kie so, which means I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in Dharma, I take refuge in Sangha. The literal translation of the character ki is to plunge into with nothing held back, as a needle plunges into cloth. And the e means to rely on. So using the Japanese, we have the vitality and the vivid image of plunging into and relying on Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, stitch after stitch. She goes on. This practice is about love as much as it is about refuge, precepts, concentration, attention to detail, making beautiful stitches, exact measurements, or completing the robe once you begin. All of these elements are important, but if I only convey the mechanics of the craft, I feel that I am failing my teachers. What they taught me was faith, devotion, and love through the medium of sewing Buddha's robe. Sewing, being taught about love and compassion, and carrying those forward. I recently went to a Dharma talk by a sewing teacher, Valerie Beer, and she said something about sewing that has stayed with me. Wearing a rakusu, wearing Buddha's robe, we are wearing our vow. The robe is the Dharma. The rakusu is the vow. We're not merely proclaiming something. We are something. And lastly, I'd like to read a quote from the sewing teacher Jean Selkirk, who compiled this booklet. She talks about her journey of sewing Buddha's robe and why she felt drawn to sew. And one of her sentences is, I had an intention to affirm my aspiration to practice. It wasn't because she wanted to be marked out as different or part of something, but she wanted to affirm her aspiration to practice, which I really feel like is a wonderful description of why we come to sewing how we come to sewing. And then she says, continuing to practice and learn, and this is a description of her sewing her first rakusu. Continuing to practice and learn, I noticed that sewing and wearing Buddha's robe deepened my understanding, connection with Sangha, and meditation practice. Buddha's robe began to express for me the essence of compassionate bodhisattva practice. First came the effort of offering stitches without thought of gaining anything, even finishing. Then, entreating the robe with gentle respect, as if we were one, not two, the robe became tangibly steeped in the caring stillness and openness cultivated by practice. So I hope that's given some flavor, some taste of how a rakusu, how Buddha's robe is imagined, how it comes into being in our minds, and then in our hands, and then how it continues to move through us. So thank you. I'll pass this over to Anne.
Yes, thank you for Joel and Anne and Peg for inviting me to participate today and to speak as one of the people who participated in Jukai ceremony here at Appamada most recently, almost exactly a year ago. So I'm going to speak to that, to participate having participated in the Jukai ceremony and how that resonated with me and how it's continued to extend throughout my life and practice. Jukai is it's a beautiful ritual ceremony of receiving the precepts, with the whole part has been so carefully outlined by Joel, and about the 10 grave precepts of non-stealing and non-killing, etc. And then there's the aspect of formally taking refuge. And I have not read this recent book by Nancy Mujo Baker, but I heard a talk that she gave on Tricycle Talks. And she talked in this way about how when in Jukai, that we, in taking formally the precepts, that it's not even necessarily so much taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but as Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and then also being a reference to how it's this formal, that we all are Buddhas, and it's also this formal recognition of each of us as Buddhas. And in the ceremony, and then also in contemplating the precepts, there's this great sense for me of harmony. And part of it is in the receiving of a formal lineage chart that through Peg traces all the way back to Shakyamuni Buddha, through all those many generations. So I have this bloodline through there, and that not that I'm special or different than anybody else who has maybe not taken Jukai, but that it really is an embodiment of that. At least that's my sense of it, how I'm feeling into it, and our whole intertwined karma going back. And that, I guess, also for me, that more a deeper sense of how we are the present day Buddhas in this and we will be ancestors in the future. Another thing that she actually mentioned in that talk, that is a quote from Dogen, is like, in Zazen, what precept is not followed? And so I'm going through the Jukai, which feels like one of those spots where everything is suspended in the formality of it, of the hearing and repeating vows, bowing to altars and to what they represent, that there's this great sense of harmony. And that is like in Zazen, when we're entering that ceremony of Zazen, that there's also this sense of stepping beyond our discursive nature, even if we don't necessarily perceive that we are entering that great flow of Buddha's way, and connecting in a more aware way of our part in the absolute reality. So, and then also, I feel like in this whole contemplation, it's really kind of a for me as well, it's like with sewing my rakusu, and well, first starting with taking the precepts class with Peg, and then later sewing my rakusu with Anne, and then going to the Jukai ceremony. It also brought about this great sense of the harmony, and that warm hand from my teachers. And it's really extended beyond the ceremony as well, in terms of continuing just to contemplate in my daily life how the precepts are guiding my actions, where I am not maybe wholeheartedly being in alignment with the precepts, the ways that it's not a black and white issue. There's many different ways to see how, as human beings, we, with greed, hate, and delusion, are not skillful, and that we are even in little ways, like with maybe having the intoxicant of speaking in front of other people. Is that an intoxicant? Is that or is it just alcohol and drugs? That just feeling into and reading all these different ways of holding and contemplating them. But overall, I just wanted to come back to the point of, for me, the Jukai, that it is it was definitely a stepping into this harmony of being in taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the harmony that is expressed from and with our Sangha. So thank you.
Yeah, John.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you and thank you for giving what I consider the best Dharma talk that could be given before a Jukai ceremony. It was just covered it so beautifully, and such a great introduction, and it makes me so excited about the ceremony. And then it also brings back such wonderful memories of how deeply enriching and nourishing an experience it was of sewing a rakusu. And then the ceremony itself, I just, all the work that Peg went into it, put into it with the beautiful artifacts that are still on a very special shelf in my world. And as you were saying, Anne, having the lineage from Shakyamuni Buddha to Peg, all that, it's just to have that. And then, of course, to be given our Dharma name. It's just a really, really sweet thing that we get to live into this afternoon. Thank you so much.
The one thing I was going to say, if I was going to mention my Dharma name, is that another aspect of that, the harmonious nature of that, is that the person who I received the precepts with, also part of his Dharma name is part of my Dharma name as well. This is Sheen, heart, mind. And so it's a special, I find very resonant aspect of the names that Peg gave us, that we also have that connection there.
And with Flint's name and my name.
And your names, yes. Yes, once again, kind of that.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the bottom character of the characters in the writing over the altar. Here.
We have Rosemary online.
Hi, thank you so much, all of you, for your beautiful words. Anne, my question for you was, what was it like, Anne McCready? What was it like at the point, I know you knew this ahead of time, but when you returned in the ceremony, when you returned to Peg, what was?
Oh, returning the Rakusu?
Yeah.
Well, I took the precepts class in 2015-16. So I had a number of years of wearing other people's Rakusus here. And in fact, it was almost like there were other reasons I couldn't sew during that time frame, or I chose not to sew during that time frame for family reasons. But it also, I was like, well, I'm expressing my vow here by wearing another person's rakusu. So yeah, it was not a surprise. And it was, and I really appreciate the thought and the sentiment and practice behind that rakusu return. And then we recently, because John Miller, who had also taken precepts at the same time I did, was moving away, there's a rakusu return ceremony, and with that happened a little earlier than it might have otherwise. I think it's usually right at the annual mark, and this time it was a little bit before because of his impending departure, and that was also another. It was really the ceremony. Anne and Lori led that, and it was really we did all the vows again. That's another thing I also in the meantime of. There was another precept ceremony I participated in. It's like, I love this, like coming back to the precepts, coming back to the ceremony, being showered again with these teachings and with this opportunity to re-express my vows and to confess and repent too, all that goes with it. So a long answer there, sorry, but that's a question.
Thank you.
Hello? Somehow you don't show as muted, but we can't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, good morning, everyone. And everyone, thank you. Starting with Peg, and before Peg, our ancestors, and each of you for sharing this morning. I'm so touched by what you shared, Anne, because it ties in with something you said during a talk a comment you made during a talk a while ago. I don't remember what the talk was. I don't remember what the topic was. I'm sure it was Buddhism. But you said that what the speaker spoke to at the time made you feel immersed and surrounded by an ocean of love and compassion. And as I heard you say that today and say Name Kia and then Buddha Dharma Sangha, it took me right back to your comment that day. And then it took me to our refuges, because ever since you've said that, when we say, I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in Dharma, I take refuge in Sangha, when we get to the part entering deeply into the merciful ocean of Buddha's way, I feel that immersion that you first ignited in me by your comment back when. And when we get to the part, I take refuge in Dharma, entering deeply the merciful ocean of Buddha's way. Now you've brought sowing to our refuges and our refuges to sowing for me. With each plunge of that needle, it is that immersion in our practice in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So thank you. Thank you for connecting all of those this morning for me.
Anybody else to speak online? I'm reminded, though, in just a passing comment from Nancy Mujo Baker's book, that she says, I hope I can get this right, that she's talking about, discursive minds and what we can understand with our discursive mind and so on. And she gives a definition of prajna as lived wisdom. And I'm just connecting that with what Nelda was just pointing to, that it is a whole integration of person and life and our whole world that is in prajna, that and that we are given these beautiful means and tools for appreciating that in this practice.
I will say one other thing about the Rosemary's question to Anne about what did it feel like when it was time to give the Rakusu back to Peg. And I will say that there are two steps to that when a practitioner completes the sewing of the Rakusu, they give the Rakusu to their teacher, and the teacher then completes the Rakusu by inking the white silk on the back with the practitioner's Buddhist name and the date and the teacher's mark. And then the teacher, in the ceremony of Jukai, gives that Rakusu to the practitioner. And then at the end of Jukai, here at Appamada, the practitioner gives the Rakusu back to the Sangha for a year. So anyone who's taken the precepts or received precepts is free to wear that. So Buddha's robe becomes imbued with the Sangha's practice. And then after 1 year, as Anne was describing, there's another return from the Sangha via the teacher to the practitioner once again. So it's very connected. And I know in the book I was reading from, one of the teachers commented on how that so brings to mind, we can't do this by ourselves, that we all need help. We all receive support. We're all in this together.
And I might add, it gives the non-self, that it's not my Rakusu.
Right.
Yeah, I gotta say, it was harder, I think, for me to have this go to Peg for the inking because it had to go via FedEx to Chicago. And I was like, please FedEx, don't lose this package. Do not lose this package.
I just think it's the most beautiful practice at Appamada. The opportunity to wear other people's devotion in this way.
Sometimes people will say, I knew you were sick, so I wore your rakusu today.
Yeah.
Or they'll wear someone's rakusu through an intensive as a way of feeling close to them. And it's so it's very connecting in a good way, I think.
It's fun that right now we have a mysterious rakusu floating around
You don't know who it belongs to, right?
from 2005, I think.
I know who it belongs to.
Oh,
No, we're a mystery.
It's Leela's.
No, I don't think so.
Well, I emailed her,
Maybe.
and she said it was.
Oh, okay. So great. So it stays with us, doesn't she want it?
She said that if we stopped having them where we shared them with everyone, then to just put it aside and she'd get it sometime when she came back.
Okay.
But as long as it's being shared, she's.
Well, that practice isn't gonna go away.
Yeah.
Other sanghas are kind of jealous that we have that practice.
Do we have time for Milan?
Sure, of course.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to ask a very basic question. It's about the color of the rakusu. So Anne may have explained it in another talk, but I do not remember. And also, what do you think about it? Thank you.
Well, the traditional color for people who take Jukai in our lineage is dark blue. This particular blue that we sew with is a color that's distinctive for Appamada. It's the same color blue that you would find on a blueprint. And the color for an ordained priest in our lineage is black. And the color for a person with lay entrustment that is authorized to teach but not ordained as a priest is green, as you can see Joel wearing this beautiful forest green. And it has sky blue stitching. So it's forest and sky is represented in this one. The blue rakusus, the people who are sewing have a choice of thread colors depending on their own preference, but from a set of sort of approved colors. So no hot pink.
No sparkles.
And when you receive Dharma transmission, you sew yet another rakusu. It's a lot of sewing. So I said to Joko, seems to involve a lot of sewing. I didn't think Zen involved a lot of sewing, but it turns out it involves a lot of sewing, which made her laugh. So this brown one, this one is one that matches the one that Flint and I sewed at the same time when he was going to receive Dharma transmission. So it's brown and it has you can't see this, but it has an Appamada color unique to Flint and I, which is a kind of blue violet, pale blue violet, so kind of a almost a periwinkle color, yeah. But
For the thread.
For the thread, yeah. So so the envelopes then are usually made out of the same material or a similar material until you have Dharma transmission, and then they can be kind of wild, you know. But they are lined then with a silky fabric so that the rakusu can slide into it easily. So traditionally it's silk, but it might be just like a satin fabric. So that's the meaning of the colors in our particular lineage, the Suzuki Roshi lineage. You'll sometimes see this interpreted differently in different lineages. So, but generally speaking, black is the color for a priest typically. Some places are using black for Jukai, but we don't do that in our lineage. Yeah, so, yeah. And you'll sometimes see a different version that has a big ring on one side. That's common in the Rinzai tradition. And they sew a slightly different rakusu, and I think they sew a slightly different rakusu at Great Vow. but the colors are the same. Yeah. So I saw Tom Wright's Rakusu, who he's a pretty famous teacher, and I can't. It looked like scales or something. What is the that? Stitching? The stitching. Yeah. Yeah, there are a variety of sort of dress up stitches for people who have, a role, and sometimes the big robes will be fancy colors, hot pink or green or whatever, and it's sort of ceremonial. There's a rain stitch, which is little. That's what it was. Those little rain stitches. Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty common in the bird foot, which they're doing for Flint, which is another fancy stitch. They're doing for Flint and Madison. So, yeah. So there are these little amendments that sometimes happen, but the idea of the rakusu is to be plain, not to incite envy or you're not supposed to say to somebody, "Wow, that's a beautiful rakusu," you're not supposed to have any pride in the rakusu, even though you have a certain satisfaction in having stitched it, but they're not intended to be flashy or show off your skills or be, they're supposed to be very, traditionally made from scraps of charnel cloth used to wrap bodies in graveyards. The Buddha didn't want it to be something that would inspire pride or envy. Yeah.
Nellie, I would like to ask you, since you have trained in a different tradition, are there differences that you note between what Peg was describing, what Anne or the Anns have described?
The Anns.
In the tradition that you have studied in?
That's a long story, actually. Well, Taizen Deshimaru is a teacher who brought Zen to France, and actually, for Jukai and priest ceremony, people could. There was no rule about the color, so people could sew a rakusu, but it was not blue. I mean, people sewed rakusu like black or brown, so there was no difference between practitioners and the teacher, actually. But then he died, and well, that's a long story, but some Dharma heirs decided to apply the Japanese rule, which is to have like black rakusus when you receive Jukai, and then for pre-ceremony, and the brown only for teachers. But some teachers kept the tradition of Deshimaru, so I ordained with a teacher who still accepted like different colors of rakusus for Jukai. But the weird thing is that my sewing teacher had a fabric which was blue actually when I prepared my rakusu for Jukai. So actually my rakusu for Jukai is blue, which is I find beautiful because now I'm with you. So maybe that was a sign. But my rakusu for pre-ceremony, it's gray actually.
Gray. Oh wow.
Yeah. And my teacher decided to write not in Japanese, but in normal letters. So yeah, so it's also different because some teachers, I think Peggy still write with kanjis. I've seen Jules, so he decided like it was not good for calligraphy, and he was like, well, let's change the form and write with the alphabet.
Some I've seen the Dharma name written out in and then also the translation provided on the back as well. So it seems there's a lot of variety. I also realized after at some point after I started sewing that there are lineages that they don't sew their own rakusus. They purchase them. I'm like, oh, here I am. Why did I end up in this lineage where you can't just buy it? But no, it was a good practice though. It was really good. Despite the tears and So it was, I appreciated the opportunity.
Laurie and I were here yesterday, and we got to watch Peg and Flint do just a couple of steps in the preparation of the materials that will be shared with Cassie and others today, and not one of them was trivial. Folding the paper has to be done individually, very carefully, and not just precisely, but matching the requirements of the other pieces. Making this, they let us try out making the big red stamp on a piece of paper. The ink sticks to the stamp in such a way that the ink block sticks to the stamp in such a way that you have to be really careful not to, fling it across the room, not to smear it all over your hands and everything. It's, like I say, none of the steps are trivial. And Flint said, this is a big undertaking for someone who is receiving Jukai, and it is not trivial for the teacher, for the teachers. Yeah.
Well, and I was aware of that with the white silk. Here, we've all spent so much time on this rakusu, and it's this pure white, and then our teacher does it, and there can be no mistakes. There's no white out for it, and they're using black permanent ink and the red, and there can, if there are mistakes, it stays on there, and there are no mistakes.
It's a challenge. It is a challenge. We had to print this year all new lineage documents.
Right.
One set for Flint and one set for me. That meant they had to be redrawn, and they're, like this big, this wide. And so we had to have them, they had to be redrawn and printed. So the one for me, of course, ends in my name. The one for Flint ends in his name through me. So I said, you've got to do all of the Jukais, because then people get both of our names.
That's nice.
Not just my name. So, yeah, so that was really, we had to send for special paper, that size for one thing, and it has to be all cotton, because that's what is enduring.
Yes.
So, and my printer's calling me up and he's saying, the Pantone number 37 is slightly different from the example you gave me. Is that gonna be okay? I said, is it blue? No, it's red, but it's slightly less orangey red. I'm like, it's fine. He was in a panic, because he knew how important these documents
Yeah, obviously you had let him know that.
Yeah, but it was very challenging, graphically challenging, because it's such a big document. So fun. I sent Flint's to Hawaii, and mine are here. Okay. I'll finish.